Kia ora mai tātou, he mihi kawana kia koutou ko taimai nei anō I raro te tuanui a tēnei whare, he mihi kawana ki ngā kārangatanga kei wainganui a koutou. Nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good morning everybody, welcome to see everybody. Day 3, week 3, we're not counting. We're scheduled to start in just a few minutes, and we just had a few preliminary matters just to cover off. For the council yesterday, we were just asking for a response in terms of some of the consents and the rollovers that might. We're happy to hear about that later on today with the other matters, if that's okay with you. I don't think we've got any new people who have joined us. Is anyone new to the hearing thus far? This is your first day that you've come along? Apart from Napier and Hastings, because we've been doing introductions at the start of each of our weeks. So maybe we'll just quickly introduce ourselves, and then we'll make a start.
Kia ora, I'm Ro Kirikiri. I'm Wellington-based Independent Commissioner. Know this area pretty well. I mean, Mark and I go back a long time in the Hastings District Council. I'm just glad to be back here again.
Kia ora, Roger Marker. I'm Hawke's Bay guy, and been on several of these related panels.
Well, good morning everybody. Antoine Coffin, I've been the chair for Plan Change 9. About 25 years in Māori resource management and come from a heritage background. I'm an anthropologist who fell into planning, not the other way around. Good to see everybody.
Marina, my name's Brent Cowie. I'm a freshwater ecologist. I've been working in resource management for about almost 40 years now, 40 years as of next May. And those roles have included 12 years running the resource management side of a regional council and 20 years as a private consultant. Thank you.
Kia ora. My name's Greg Ryder. I'm also a freshwater ecologist, water quality scientist, based in Dunedin. Been down there for a long time now. I have my own business, consulting in RMA and ecology and freshwater quality, and I've been an independent commissioner for, 20 or so years.
Well, that's us. Just in terms of your presentation today, we're happy to present in the way that you see fit. You've got quite a bit of time there. Thank you very much for the summaries, and we've also received the legal submissions. I did notice it was about 5 to 9 that we actually received them. I'm not sure if you sent them at 5 to 9, but we got them at 5 to 9 that night. So I'm not sure all of the panel have read the legal submissions. I've been able to go through them yesterday, but we'd be happy for you to just take your time taking us through the legal submissions and then the summaries as you see fit. We wouldn't mind some introductions, but so there's. We know the names on paper, but we might not know the names and faces. So that would be really useful to us, and take your time with that so we can write the names down. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Asha Davidson. I'm the council for Hastings District and Napier City Councils. But I will let probably individuals introduce themselves.
Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Mark Clues. I've been working for the Hastings District Council for coming up 36 years, and the Hastings City Council before the District Council. I'm a land use planner by training, dabbling here in some water issues, and know one or two of our Hawke's Bay whānau here. So pleased to be here to assist the Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Clues.
Morning everyone, my name is Cameron Drury. I'm a planning consultant with a company called Strategy. I've been practicing planning here in Hawke's Bay since 2004 or so. Been a planning consultant since 2006. During that time I've worked in both district council functions as well as regional council functions. Over that time prepared a lot of applications for ground and surface water takes, water harvesting proposals, and was also the consultant who pulled together the Twyford water user group global consent approach as well. So yeah, enjoy getting involved in this matter.
Good morning, I'm Annette Sweeney and I'm a planning consultant and free waters engineer with Good Earth Matters Consulting. and I've been working in this space in terms of consenting infrastructure and plans in terms of water resources infrastructure for about 25 years, and have been working with Hastings District Council in terms of their water supply consents for the best part of about 10 years now.
And you work in the same office as Ms Gray?
I do. Yes. Ms Wilson.
Kia ora koutou, my name is Paulina Wilhelm. I'm the manager of city development for Napier City Council. I've been in Napier City Council for the last 4 years, but involved in policy planning for the last 20 years, mainly managing teams that work in strategic policy and policy development. I'm a forestry engineer, that is my studies, and I have a master in natural resource management. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you today.
Yes, good morning. My name is Russell Bond. I'm the manager of water strategy for Napier City. I've been in operations and asset management since for a good 23, 24 years now, and I've had the pleasure of working with councils in the far north, Hamilton City, Queenstown, Central Otago and Napier as well. So.
It would probably be inappropriate to ask you which is the best place in the country.
Correct. Yeah.
We won't ask you that question. I must say, oh, sorry.
Sorry, kia ora koutou, ko Brett Chapman aho, no Marainui aho, local born and bred in Napier. I've worked at Hastings District Council for the last 15 years as the water services manager, 3 waters manager. I've had 30 years experience in managing drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. So I'm looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you. Yes, yeah. Obviously, we're happy for you to present in the way you see fit, but we wouldn't mind understanding what the order of presenters is going to be. Thanks.
So what I was intending is to just outline my legal submissions.
Sure.
Then I thought we'd call this sort of contextual evidence, I guess you'd call it, from Mr. Clues and Ms. Wilhelm. And then I thought we would call Mr. Chapman and Mr. Bond, which basically cover the actual delivery of water services within the councils, and then get into the planning evidence with Ms. Sweeney first, and then Mr. Drury. That was the plan of attack.
Thank you.
If that suits. But in terms of answering questions, I think I'll have everyone sit up, and if there's questions to, for instance, Mr. Chapman, that Ms. Sweeney might be best to answer, if you sort of allow some flexibility in terms of who's best placed to answer it, just to make sure you get the best information.
Yeah, we're very happy with that approach. Thank you.
Yes, so I've, hopefully everyone's got a copy of the legal submissions.
These ones are
I
titled
do.
Outline of Submissions. Yeah.
Outline of submissions for Hastings District Council in Napier, date of the 21st of June, albeit quite late on the 21st of June. Apologies for that.
We're getting lots of electronic mail late at night.
Yeah. I'll take you through it. If there's anything that I'm repeating, given that you've heard 3 weeks of legal submissions, I'm happy to take anything
There's
that's read.
instances of deja vu, we'll let
Yes.
you know. Yes.
And I have tried to read a lot of those and hopefully just adopt other people's submissions or refer to them where I can. So as you know, these submissions are given on behalf of Hastings District and Napier City Councils. I've referred to them as the councils because I couldn't think of anything more punchy, so I'm not intending to include the regional council
I was
in
under
that.
the understanding there was a rivalry between Hastings and Napier. I haven't seen any evidence of it thus far,
No.
and you all sitting together probably proves the point.
We've tried to set out in the evidence, particularly that of Mr. Clues, that the councils have played an active role in the preparation of proposed Plan Change 9, and Mr. Clues has gone through in quite some detail the significant background work that's gone into Plan Change 9. So while supportive of what Plan Change 9 seeks to achieve overall, the provisions will have a significant impact on the councils in their various capacities, particularly in terms of their roles as water suppliers and in terms of their obligations to provide for the well-being of their current and future communities. So the councils filed reasonably extensive submissions and further submissions on Plan Change 9 with a view to ensuring the provisions are workable and consistent with their various statutory obligations. So we've called evidence to support those submissions, both to provide the panel with the context and reasons for the positions and detailed planning evidence to explain the rationale for the changes sought. And you will have seen we prepared a full track change version of Plan Change 9. That was based on the 42A version. We haven't produced a further track change version of the addendum report, but particularly Mr. Drury and Ms. Sweeney will address where any changes in that report have addressed their concerns. I've also tried to identify...
Appendix A.
Appendix A has...
And so they were referred directly back to the evidence in chief that we have?
Yes, other than where I've noted in the third column summary, that suggests that Ms. Sweeney will give some
update
further
on the addendum report.
commentary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Moving on to paragraph 4, as I say, coming at the end of several weeks of hearings and numerous sets of legal submissions, I don't intend to address you on the tests for assessing plan changes. I've focused on some of the legal issues that the panel will need to consider when assessing the council's submissions and determining the most appropriate content for Plan Change 9. And in summary, those are the relevance of the freshwater management and urban development NPSs and how those can be reconciled, the approach to assessing prohibited activity status in Rule Tank 12, and the approach to assessing the appropriate extent of source protection zones for the Hastings district. So turning to the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management, again, by this stage of the hearing, you will have heard numerous submissions on the impact of that NPS and how it fits with Plan Change 9, and I don't intend to address you on that in detail, but I can indicate that the councils generally endorse the approach set out by Mr. Gardner-Hopkins in his legal submissions for Mr. Apple. And in summary, those points were, if there is scope, then changes which give effect to the NPS-FM must be made. Care needs to be taken to read the NPS's policies in context, and while directive language is used, this only applies in certain contexts and where definitions are clearly met. And I've discussed this particularly in relation to Policy 11 later in the submissions. And finally, given the significant effort that's been put into the TANK collaborative process and into Plan Change 9 so far, the councils agree with the submissions from Mr. Apple and others that Plan Change 9 should not be withdrawn, even if it doesn't go so far as to give complete effect to the NPS. So on that last point, the councils have carefully considered whether they should endorse the approach taken by Ngāti Kānunu and others who seek the withdrawal of Plan Change 9 and for the process to be restarted with the requirements of the NPS and particularly Te Manawatūai as the primary focus. The councils acknowledge that viewpoint. However, they are conscious of the significant time, effort and expense that has been incurred by all participants in reaching the current version. On balance, they consider it as appropriate to bank the effort that's been made by getting the best possible version of Plan Change 9 in place, even if further changes may be required to fully implement the NPS. This will at least allow progress to be made towards achieving the freshwater quality and quantity objectives. And just to note that in terms of the relief sought by the councils, the expert planning evidence has not identified any aspect that would render Plan Change 9 inconsistent with the NPS-FM.
Insofar as your submissions are concerned.
Insofar as the relief that the councils are seeking.
I guess the other thing in that context is the council has to redo its whole regional plan by the end of 2024 anyway.
Right.
So that gives them an opportunity to implement the NPS-FM in full, assuming it's still there in its current form.
Yes.
Yeah.
All councils are grappling with that, yes.
More than grappling.
Yes. So turning to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which was also promulgated in 2020, just as Plan Change 9 must give effect to the NPS FM, it must equally give effect to the NPS on urban development. So the Regional Council, Napier City and Hastings District are all listed as Tier 2 local authorities in Appendix 2 to the NPS. So the provisions of the NPS apply equally to the Regional Council. There is an obligation on all three local authorities to at all times provide at least sufficient development capacity to meet expected demand for housing and for business land over the short term, medium term and long term. And Mr. Cluse's evidence provides a detailed discussion of what this obligation means for the councils in practice. In short, they must have enough land live zoned for expected demand within the next 3 years, either zoned or proposed to be zoned within 3 to 10 years, and identified in a future development strategy for demand in the 10 to 30 year period. And that, as I say, includes demand for housing and business land. The requirement is that that land must also be infrastructure ready. And I agree with the legal submissions for low corporation that the reference to infrastructure in the NPS-UD necessarily includes the ability to actually service the intended development. The ability to provide water to service planned development is a precursor to rezoning land or to constructing the infrastructure necessary to service it. A plan change to open up land for residential or business development could not succeed without evidence that it could be serviced for water. Any such proposal would fail to give effect to the requirement of the regional policy statement that I've set out there at Policy Urban Development 13, that the provision, development which will not be serviced, and that includes from the provision of potable water, will be avoided. And as you know, avoided is a very directive term. Mr. Cluse has explained how the population projections used for HPUD's 2017 are now found to have significantly underestimated actual growth, and projected growth is now substantially greater than what that document predicts. The councils are committed to and have already demonstrated efficiency and conservation measures which will allow them to provide water to a growing population within their existing allocated volume. In Hastings' case, it's actually relinquished allocation for 6 million cubic metres of water annually and is still currently able to service its growing population. The HPUD's review process is not yet complete. Depending on its outcome and the expected demand it identifies, it might be possible for that demand to be serviced for water within existing allocations. But at this stage, we do not know that. Given the high growth demands outlined in Mr. Cluse's evidence, it may be unlikely. The Regional Council's response to the panel's queries about how municipal supplies are affected by Plan Change 9 tellingly states, enabling HDC and NCC to retain their current allocations will provide them some room for growth in the short term, but also acknowledges the need to phase out and avoid over-allocation in the tank catchment. Now, no evidence has been called for the Regional Council to support the contention that the consented volumes are sufficient for growth in the short term, which I've assumed means the next 3 years, given that that is how the Urban Development NPS defines it. The reference to providing some room for growth indicates that the author does not properly appreciate the obligations that apply to HBRC under the NPS-UD. Providing some room for short-term growth is not sufficient to meet the Regional Council's statutory obligation. That simply fails to implement the directive requirements of the NPS. The councils are not seeking free rein to have unlimited access to water to service the growth they are required to provide for. They support the numerous provisions requiring efficiency measures and working within existing allocations being the clear starting point and preference. What they do seek, though, is that Plan Change 9 not foreclose the possibility that an increased allocation may be required in order for them to meet their urban development obligations. At present, there is a real possibility that such a proposal would be a prohibited activity. Ms Sweeney's evidence from para 19 sets the issue out clearly. An application for water which exceeds current consented allocation is either a discretionary or prohibited activity. And as Ms Sweeney explains, there's real doubt that the criteria under Tank 11 would be satisfied. And the more likely outcome is that Tank 12 would apply and no application could be made at all. Ms Sweeney has suggested an amendment to Tank 11 to clarify that increased allocations for municipal supply are captured, and this is the preferred relief. Alternatively, she suggests a non-complying activity for such applications. In either case, there would be a full assessment against relevant objectives and policies and assessment of effects. Given the specificity of the objectives and policies, in my submission, it could be expected that only proposals that could demonstrate every effort had been made at ensuring efficiency and that the bare minimum of additional allocation was sought would have a chance of being approved. In terms of those objectives and policies and some consequential changes, Ms Sweeney sets out some changes that are sought, with an important one being that growth predictions should be tagged to the current growth projections rather than HPUD's 2017. Continued reference to outdated growth projections is not justified in the face of the MPS UD's obligations to keep pace with current projected demand and places all three councils at risk of being in breach of their statutory obligations. So the council officer's reference to allowing, quote, some growth while phasing out over-allocation may be a suggestion that the provisions of the MPSs have conflicting requirements and that HBRC has made a policy choice to implement the freshwater management MPS over that for urban development. As the High Court held in Transpower New Zealand and Auckland Council, there is no basis on which to prefer or give priority to the provisions of one national policy statement over another, much less to treat one as trumping the other. Rather, the courts are clear that the decision maker must attempt to reconcile any competing provisions. The Supreme Court in EDS and King Salmon held that decision makers dealing with potentially incompatible policies must make a thoroughgoing attempt at finding a way to reconcile them. And that requirement was recently reiterated in the High Court's decision in Tauranga Environmental Protection Society, where the court summarised the task as follows, and I'll just read that because it's quite short. A decision maker considering a plan change application must identify the relevant policies and pay careful attention to the way they're expressed. As with any legal instrument, the text of the instrument may dictate the result. When policies pull in different directions, their interpretation should be subjected to close attention to their expression, and only, stick to the words since I'm quoting, where there is doubt after that, recourse to Part 2 is required. The Supreme Court in the King Salmon decision and the High Court in Tauranga Environmental Protection Society emphasised that being too quick to resort to an overall balancing exercise with reference to Part 2 was a legal error. The overriding obligation is to give effect to both sets of requirements. In the case of Plan Change 9, the conflict is most clearly crystallised in Rule Tank 12, which makes most applications for increased takes a prohibited activity. In my submission, and as set out above, this rule conflicts with Policy 2 of the NPSUD. Tier 2 local authorities at all times provide at least sufficient development capacity to meet expected demand for housing and for business land over the short term, medium term and long term. The prohibited activity rule is presumably intended to give effect to Policy 11 of the Freshwater Management MPS. Freshwater is allocated and used efficiently. All existing over-allocation is phased out and future over-allocation is avoided. So in considering how to give effect to both requirements, applying the directive of the higher court set out above, the panel must first pay close attention to the expression of these policies. In this regard, careful attention is required, what is actually required in terms of avoiding over-allocation as provided for in the NPS-FM. Over-allocation is to be phased out, which means it is expected to take some time for that to occur. The reference to future over-allocation suggests that phase is to occur after existing over-allocation has been brought within within appropriate limits. In relation to the limits required to be met, Plan Change 9 provides for 90 million cubic metres as an interim limit. However, that's not a take limit. That's been set in accordance with 3.17 of the NPS. The basis for it has been challenged by a number of submitters, and the Council's submission is that this is more properly referred to as a target. It is therefore not the case that an allocation which exceeds the interim limit or target would necessarily be contrary to phasing out existing over-allocation or result in future over-allocation. The second stage is for the panel to consider whether both policies can be given effect to. And in my submission, it's entirely possible for Plan Change 9 to give effect to both Policy 2 and Policy 11 by amending the prohibited status to non-complying and or providing for increased allocations for municipal uses as a discretionary activity to be assessed against the relevant objectives and policies. That activity status leaves open the possibility of a particular proposal that implements the growth obligations of the NPS-UD being consented, provided an applicant can demonstrate that water will be used efficiently and will not otherwise conflict with the NPS's requirements, as those are reflected in the objectives and policies of Plan Change 9. It's also important that objectives and policies be amended to better reflect the obligation to enable housing and business land through provision of water. If that is not done, the result will be a default prohibited activity, given the ability to comply with objectives and policies that reference outdated growth projections and do not contemplate the need to service growth. In my submission, where a path is available to the panel that reconciles and gives effect to both policies, a decision to retain prohibited status would amount to favouring one NPS over the other, meaning Plan Change 9 would breach the requirements of Section 67(3)A in failing to give effect to the NPS-UD. So turning to my second topic, which is prohibited activity status. In the event that the panel does not consider that the status of Rule Tank 12 should be amended from prohibited to non-complying just by virtue of the NPS-UD, you are nevertheless obliged to consider whether prohibited status is the most appropriate way of giving effect to the objectives of Plan Change 9 and the existing regional plan. It's important to bear in mind that having a non-complying activity granted consent is by no means an easy path. Following the decisions referred to earlier, including King Salmon and resource consent decisions such as RJ Davidson, the courts have been at pains to ensure that any consent granted is consistent with the objectives and policies of the plan under which it is decided. This is generally in recognition that the objectives and policies reflect the higher order statutory documents and ultimately Part 2 of the RMA. They also reflect the outcome of the community's participation in the plan process, and generally, courts are slow to depart from that collective view. Locally, Hastings has had a number of decisions which declined non-complying proposals where they conflicted with the objectives and policies of the recently approved Hastings District Plan. And it's important to note that this is even where it was accepted that effects on the environment were less than minor. In the Stone decision that I've quoted there, the court said that the Hastings proposed district plan, as it was then, has recently been prepared and should be respected as containing the most recent statement of the community's aspirations for its district. To grant consent may give rise to concerns about public confidence in the consistent application of the rules in the proposed district plan. A further example is the Tauranga Environmental Protection Society decision, which only came out about 3 weeks ago. That case concerned an application by Transpower New Zealand for discretionary activity consent to realign electricity transmission lines, which was granted by the Council and upheld by the Environment Court. However, on appeal, the High Court found that there were provisions of the Regional Coastal Plan which meant that the grant of consent was an error of law. The provisions there were policies that implemented the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement and provided cultural bottom lines, which needed to be given effect to. So I've referred to those decisions because in my submission they illustrate that the objectives and policies of a plan have real teeth when it comes to assessing discretionary and non-complying activities. In my submission, this addresses the concerns set out in the Section 32 report that prohibited status would avoid the potential for assessing a single activity as no more than minor while not fully accounting for cumulative effects. As I've noted, and has repeatedly been recognised in the Environment Court decisions, an absence of adverse effects is not decisive of an application for consent. In my submission, prohibited status is not necessary to achieve the policies and objectives of Plan Change 9. On the other hand, Mr Drury and Ms Sweeney point out objectives and policies of the regional plan which aren't affected by Plan Change 9, which would not be achieved if prohibited status was imposed. The non-complying fallback status or discretionary, as we're seeking for municipal takes, will, with the right objectives and policies, provide an opportunity for proposals which have real environmental merit, while providing no realistic pathway to consent for those that offend what Plan Change 9 is trying to achieve. So the third topic for my submissions is the source protection zones. So an outstanding issue between Hastings District and Hawke's Bay Regional Council is the mapping of source protection zones around Hastings District Council's bores. As outlined in the evidence of Mr Chapman and Ms Sweeney, Hastings seeks a conservative line which encompasses the areas identified in both the numerical and analytical models. And I should note there that while we didn't include a track change version of Schedule 35 in our track change version, there would need to be a consequential change to just capture that, or if the panel were minded to grant the relief in terms of the map, that would just need to be reflected in Schedule 35. So in deciding which map to prefer, the requirements of Section 32 to consider costs and benefit and the risk of acting on uncertain information are relevant to the panel's decision. A useful starting point is to consider the purpose of source protection zones. Objective Tank 9 provides that activities in source protection areas for registered drinking water suppliers do not become unsuitable for human consumption. And that's given effect to by Policy Tank 6, which provides that the quality of groundwater of the Heritonga Plains and surface waters used as source water for registered drinking water suppliers will be protected. And it's noted that the requirement to protect is a directive term with no qualifiers given. So as described in paragraph 45 of Mr Chapman's evidence, the purpose from the Council's perspective of SPZ plans and associated regulatory controls is to ensure that applicants engage with water suppliers in developing their applications and that appropriate assessments are undertaken to evaluate the impact of proposed activities on the drinking water source. Importantly, what is sought to be protected here is the safe and secure provision of drinking water to the community, or put another way, the avoidance of a significant adverse effect on the environment in the form of potentially life-threatening contamination of drinking water. Even where the possibility of that type of effect arising is one of low probability, its extremely high potential impact means that it is an effect as defined in the RMA and must be considered. The Regional Council prefers that the source protection zone maps around the HDC bores be much smaller. And the rationale for that is set out in the reply evidence of Mr Rakowski, who essentially states that the numerical model contains less uncertainty than the analytical model and is therefore less conservative. Mr. Rakowski's evidence does not assert that there is no or negligible risk associated with the discharge of contaminants of land use activities in areas that are within HDC's preferred SPZ, but outside HBRC's. Rather, he appears to be saying that there is a lower probability of an effect occurring. In my submission, that is not a sufficient reason to prefer the smaller area. Even if the panel accepts that there is a low probability of contamination in these areas, having regard to the very high potential impact, it is open to the panel to prefer the more conservative approach preferred by Hastings District Council. And Section 32.2 provides a useful, indeed mandatory way to assess the alternative maps before the panel. So in terms of the benefits anticipated from implementation of the source protection zone provisions, in my submission, a greater benefit is clearly achieved through having a larger area within the source protection zones. Mr. Chapman will address you further on this, but a key point that he pointed out to me this morning is that the Omahu industrial area is within Hastings District Council's map, but outside the Regional Council's map. And that's a great example of the types of activities that we really want to be able to capture and assess for risk. More activities that might have a potential impact on source water will be caught, and measures to ensure there is no such effect identified and put in place. Even if one such risk is avoided, in my submission, that's a clear benefit which must be factored into your assessment. In terms of the costs of having a larger source protection zone, Ms. Sweeney's evidence addresses the regulatory burden arising from having an SPZ applying over a person's land, and concludes that there is no additional burden where the area overlays the unconfined aquifer. In that area, consent would be required anyway, and the SPZ notation simply adds a matter of consideration. She notes that a consenting requirement is triggered for some activities in areas not within the unconfined aquifer for a restricted discretionary activity. That is a relevant cost which the panel needs to weigh up, although Ms. Sweeney's evidence notes that a permitted activity is not a zero cost option. The other aspect of Section 32.2 which is relevant is the requirement to assess the risk of acting or not acting if there is uncertain or insufficient information about the subject matter of the provisions. Mr. Chapman will address the panel on his response to Mr. Rakowski's evidence on the superiority of the numerical models over the analytical method. Both are tools to predict the behaviour of groundwater, which is itself relatively unpredictable and is subject to changes as a result of unpredictable events, such as flooding and earthquakes. And I've noted there Mr. Rakowski's evidence on stream depletion, so not directly on the source protection zones, but given in another context. I won't read that, but it acknowledges that there is a relatively high connection to the rest of the Hiratonga aquifer system, and the exact nature of connection may be uncertain. So the panel is clearly dealing with uncertain information and must consider associated risks. The risk of acting on the basis of the Regional Council preferred SPZ maps is that they will prove to be insufficiently conservative and potential sources of contamination will not be picked up and assessed. That is a risk that cannot properly be ignored or dismissed. Mr. Rakowski describes the merging of analytical and numerical methods as unnecessarily conservative. That statement is not explained further, and I submit that it is an opinion Mr. Rakowski is not qualified to give and must be disregarded. The degree of conservatism appropriate when dealing with serious risk to human health is for this panel, not a modeller. The panel will need to consider the probability that Mr. Rakowski's model might have underestimated the area of concern and the implications of any such error. In my submission, even if that probability is low, the potential costs of being wrong are so substantial and the costs of identifying a larger area so minor in the scheme of things that an evaluation under Section 32 weighs heavily in favour of Hastings District Council's preferred maps. so those are my submissions. Happy to take questions or to take them in the context of submissions to witnesses if that's easier.
We'll just see if we've got any general questions regards to your... I've got a card. Can I ask them?
Yeah, there's one general statement.
We'll open up for some questions now.
And just one comment and then one matter that you'll need to address. There's been general comment during the course of the hearings that the councils prolifically waste water compared with other water users, and that their delivery of water is inefficient and pipes leak and all that sort of thing. The only evidence that I found that addresses that comprehensively is one figure in Ms Sweeney's evidence. I would like to know from others what the current leak assessments are and what matters are being used to address that. So that's certainly, it's been a general statement from quite a lot of people.
Thank you, and Mr Chapman and Mr Bond are probably the ideal people to assist you with an answer to that question, and if there's anything specific that you'd like us to provide to help you assess those submissions, then we're happy to provide that afterwards.
The other matter is that you have criticised Mr Rakowski's qualifications to outline the evidence that he gave. He's a modeller, not a health expert, if you like. I note that Mr Chapman's evidence doesn't give his qualifications, and you say you're relying on his evidence, so when he gives his evidence I'll be asking him his qualifications, because we have Mr Rakowski's. I don't see any sign of his in his evidence. Okay.
Yes, thank you. I'd just note that you're obviously entitled to receive any evidence that assists you. Certainly experience is as much a qualifier as necessarily degrees.
It's a question of what weight we give the evidence, of course.
That's correct. My submission about Mr Rakowski's evidence was particularly in the context of him giving the opinion that the maps were inappropriately conservative. In my view, that's very much a weighting exercise and something that requires a much wider assessment than just what a model produces. So it was, I'm not criticising his modelling at all. What I'm criticising is his ability to give you an opinion as to whether or not that's a proper basis or a complete basis on which to make decisions about where or where not consent should be required.
And just the third matter, I guess, is that lots of people have brought up Rule 12 as
Rule
a prohibited
12.
activity,
Yes, that is
and question that strongly. So.
Something that's going to be an important decision for you to make, and I suppose that's a good thing that you've got lots of information to assist you.
Well, I guess it's a matter of, if we're looking at non-complying activity status, it's, and I know Mr Drury's got some suggestions about wording.
Yes.
And I think Ms Sweeney has as well. It's a matter of how broadly we want that to be available to a variety of users, not just the territorial authorities.
Yes, and Mr Drury, you're right that Mr Drury's evidence is certainly wider than just applying to municipal authorities. Obviously our case is quite focused on that because that's in our submission a Tier 2 matter, whereas some of the other matters might be a Tier 3 under the NPS FM, so you might want to provide a more limited opportunity for those, and also, yeah, so you'll understand the focus on municipal, but also trying to open the door.
Thank you.
Yes.
Were it not for the cost and time factor, what would be your position on giving full effect to the NPS FM, in particular to Mana o Te Wai? you make the point there that you considered it seriously, but because of the fact of the cost factor and the time factor, that probably it wouldn't be a wise thing to stop it and start again.
I don't know if it's fair to say it's just a cost and time. I think that it's more that the cost and time that people have put in so far have probably taken plan change or the regional plan closer to giving effect to the NPS-FM than it would be in an unamended form. And what I say is that we should bank that effort and then sort of look to bringing the whole plan in alignment with the NPS-FM, rather than throwing out everything that's been achieved so far through the Plan Change 9 and starting again. I think that we are one step closer to achieving the requirements.
Which would in effect be supporting the staged approach that people have been talking about for implementation of NPS-FM.
That's right. I don't think there's any doubt that there are going to need to be further changes to the regional plan to bring it fully in alignment. But in my view, we're a little bit closer now than we were than we would be without Plan Change 9. So,
okay. And you're all fairly comfortable with that, and as an ongoing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Yeah, good, thanks.
Thank you.
Most of my questions are related specific to the evidence, so we'll get to those, but I just had just a couple of general questions. We've heard over the course of our 2.5 weeks from a number of water users. Many of them will crassly say in the rural parts of the districts and certainly in the region. And it seemed to me and the panel members, there's a perception of the city versus the rural. And the rural users are being asked to control, restrict, limit and reduce their water takes, and the city dwellers have an unlimited supply forever. That's that was the perception
yes.
that we were hearing, and I just wondered whether you had any comments in regards to that as a general nature.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I know I've read the low court submission that was sort of seeking some alignment, and I think the witnesses should be able to assist there that the municipal suppliers don't actually supply industrial process water. So I think the low perception was that,
that was going to be my second question, getting into this. So what was business land included for municipal supply and which wasn't?
Yes, and I think Mr. Chapman's probably best, and Mr. Bond perhaps for Napier, but yeah, as I say, my understanding is that municipal supplies to industrial or business land supply the office workers, the ablutions and that sort of thing, but not actually the process water. Those are self-supplied through generally their own bores. So they would be subject to the actual and reasonable limitations rather than the slightly different provisions that apply to municipal water.
Okay, thank you. Just the other matter was just in regards, you provided some advice to us in regards to potential tensions and solutions of resolving conflict between some of the specific policies of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management and Urban Development. But I just wanted just focusing in again on the National Policy Statement for Freshwater, and particularly the hierarchy that's identified there in Te Manawatū. Did you have any view in regards to the Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 hierarchy and the potential tensions of, particularly around making sure there's enough water in the waterways for ecosystems, visitors, providing water for human needs, particularly drinking water?
I think that is likely to come up in when we get to the water storage sort of plans, and Mr. Clues I know has quite particular views on that, so he might be able to assist you. And again, the planners may have a different view, but in terms of actual allocation, other than providing some recognition of municipal and health needs and reasonable domestic needs, I don't necessarily see Plan Change 9 as differentiating too much between Tier 2 and Tier 3. As I say, that may come up later in some of the schemes where
Well, that's certainly my perception, but we've certainly heard submissions from particular submitters who are wanting much more emphasis on the Tier 1 and less on Tier 2 and 3. So yeah, there's a conflict in terms of what some of the submitters are requesting, but I was just saying if you had any particular view from your perspective.
Yes. I don't think there's anything I particularly want to add, as I say,
Okay.
Mr. Clues may do. My concern would be that it can't come at the cost of completely shutting down growth because of the competing or parallel requirements of the urban development policy statement, and that is, I mean, I'm not going to call them conflicting because, as the courts say, that's your job to try and reconcile them.
We're going to
But
reconcile potential tension between
there is certainly a potential tension between them. So but I guess that would come within the Tier 2, and perhaps the implication is that it makes life a bit difficult for those that are in Tier 3.
Yes, and we've certainly heard from submitters who consider themselves not to be in Tier 3 but in Tier 2.
Yes, I read some
and
of
others
those
who believe those who are in Tier 2 should be in Tier 3. So yeah, there's a little bit of playing going on, but that's okay. Let's move on to your
So
experts.
I was intending to call Mr. Clues
Sure.
next.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. As a land use / strategic plan, as I mentioned before, you've had a fairly comprehensive, in my view, expose of the strategic context of my evidence in chief. And I don't have anything particular to add to that, leaving aside the inevitable editorial errors that might have crept in. But I do need to make one correction, and that is in relation to paragraphs 23 to 26, where I refer to some figures around GDP and employment. I don't believe there's any errors in the figures, but I'm obliged to reference the source, which I haven't done in my document contractually, and the information has been sourced from Infometrics, which in turn receive a number of their sources of data from Stats New Zealand various surveys. So, having complied with my statutory obligations, just to pick up the point around the B and C conundrum that you're sharing around in terms of Manawatu hierarchy of obligations. I covered it a little bit in 14 in the appendix. Attachment D of my evidence, which talks about some allocation concepts, which I think are helpful. And I think it's relatively clear where much of the municipal supply priority falls, because municipal supply, it's only one pipe, so some of that water will be in the B class and some of it will be in the C class.
Yes. But it's been put to us by some submitters it's a pie that has no bottom.
I should also point out that the coat of arms for the Hastings District Council anyway, in Latin is Edis Ruris Concordia, which roughly means town and country in harmony. And you'll see in our submissions that the council has advocated, if you like, a little bit around some of the pain that might be suffered in achieving Te Manawatu for our rural community, but also that there needs to be some acknowledgement that the statutory obligations that municipal authorities have to deliver water to communities may have to come first over commercial operations, even existing ones, because ultimately, with a scarce resource, we're talking about some form of rationing. So that's probably a segue into my summary evidence. I'm not sure whether you wish me to read that or not. Depends how long we've had it. I'm happy to. It really comes to the nub of the council's case, I think. If you'd like me to read it, I'm happy to do so. Or we can
Yes,
go to
please.
questions.
Yep.
Yes. So, as I said before, my name is Mark Anthony Clues. I am the Principal Advisor District Development at the Hastings District Council. Qualifications, experience and involvement in the various stages and plan and policy changes relevant to the current hearing of PC9 are set out in my statement of evidence on the 11th of May. So clearly HTC has worked closely with the Napier City Council in terms of the Council's position on 9 and the preparation of evidence for this hearing. So Council's involvement has extended right back to the beginning and in fact before that, in the genesis of Plan Change 9. So it's an active participant. Now, my evidence sets out the strategic context for the Council's submissions. This includes the Hawke's Bay's particular reliance on the versatile source of the Heretaunga Plains and the critical importance of water in the land-based production and processing economy that is critical to the region. Not just important, it's critical. Primary production directly related industry employs 14,000 people and generates over $1 billion annually. And I'm talking there about water-dependent industry, not just any old industry. For this reason, the Council endorses a pragmatic and precautionary approach in terms of effects on people and communities, while striving to make meaningful progress on dealing with any over-allocation. And that precaution particularly applies in terms of quantity. The Council submissions have been some silent on the quality aspects. The Council believes that those are appropriate. It doesn't challenge any of those. And in terms of the question that Commissioner Kirikuya asked of the Council, that is one of the reasons why we support progressing with Plan Change number 9 to bank those improvements, rather than going back to square one and perhaps losing another 6 years. Okay, the councils do not seek...
Another 3.
On some clocks. The councils do not seek to minimise or resolve from their obligations to do their bit, both in terms of quantity and quality, to give effect to mana o te wai. Territorial authorities, however, have unique demands compared to other practice, often not recognised by our rural community, in particular in relation to its role as a municipal supply and in terms of obligations under the National Policy Statement on Urban Development to actively provide for growth. And I understand that to be growth in terms of development capacity for land, not necessarily throughput of existing businesses. The changes they seek to PC9 are largely reflective of these, as they seek to ensure priority and protection for municipal and community water supplies and flexibility to respond to changing growth demands in terms of allocation and access to water. Flexibility is an important component of the Council's submissions, that there may be various ways in which their obligations are met. A point I wish to emphasise in my evidence is the obligation under the NPSUD for all 3 councils, HDC, Napier City Council and HB Regional Council, to actively plan to accommodate urban growth demand in a way that improves housing affordability and is supported by planning and necessary infrastructure. Napier Hastings urban areas are Tier 2 urban environment under the NPSUD, and local authorities that share jurisdiction over urban environments in Tier 1 and 2 urban environments must work together while implementing the NPSUD. They are required to prepare a future development strategy every 6 years. It's reviewed every 3 years if needed, and which provides for capacity for expected demand over the next 30 years. And the councils have already had an active voluntary arrangement to work together in this with the Heretaunga Plains Urban Development Strategy, and currently are sailing to embark upon a review of that, possibly in a larger format to preempt, if you like, the changes that are coming in terms of spatial planning. So the current version of the Heretaunga the current version of this for the Heretaunga Plains is HPAS 2017. However, information for Stats New Zealand indicates that growth predictions in that document are significantly understated. And I've tried to put a table in there to show that this has been a moving feast over the last 5 years, and that's probably not unique to Hawke's Bay. It's happening around the country. but the scale of underestimation in Hawke's Bay by Stats New Zealand has been at the top end of the scale, not at the bottom. The next version will likely put expected demand at significantly higher than was currently provided for. A key issue for the councils is that municipal supply is tagged to that 2017 HPUD levels, which creates a real risk of an imminent conflict with the obligations under the NPSUD to provide and plan for the necessary infrastructure. The point I just want to highlight there, that the 10-year life of this plan is not the end of the game for urban development. We're looking at 30-year timeframes, particularly for integrating with infrastructure. So we can't just say, well, the plan will change in 10 years and we'll fix it.
The 2040 date from the evidence looks like it probably that key period in terms of infrastructure needs versus demand.
Yes. We will be looking at the next iteration for the next 30 years, and that will probably, recognising the extra population growth and some of the tensions around other resources like versatile soils as well as water, be quite a different document to the one that we've currently got. In endorsing the hierarchy of needs expressed in Te Mana o Te Wai, and the councils do endorse it, I point out that with an increasingly scarce resource, some rationing between needs and demands is inevitable. In that context, meeting statutory obligations to sustain growing communities must occur ahead of individual commercial endeavours, even if pre-existing. That is just a harsh reality of the situation we have found ourselves in. As well as addressing that specific issue, however, the councils are still concerned about how quickly the community can sustain changes required to give effect to Mana o Te Wai. They accept, however, that the improved understanding for freshwater resources in the Heretaunga catchments and the interconnected nature means that there is a need to take a greater conservation and demand management approach to reduce over-allocation across all users. While Mr Chapman and Mr Bond will talk about previous efforts for conservation demand strategies, the councils understand and accept that those will need to be put on steroids for the next period of time. Within that context, the councils, while supporting the pragmatic staged approach presented by PC9, have sought to identify changes to PC9 which will more generally assist in a pragmatic way to maintain economic well-being and ensuring growth can be provided for as required by the NPSUD and other statutory obligations within the restrictions of the available resource, including possible storage, in the light of the obligations of the NPSF 2020. The detailed changes sought are set out in the track changes version in the appended to the evidence on the swing, as Mr Davidson has said, and generally discussed in their evidence and that of Mr Drury. In summary, the Hastings District Council and Napier City Council generally support the pragmatic stepped approach proposed by PC9. However, they consider greater recognition of the priority and specific needs of people and communities for municipal and community supplies is needed. So I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you.
The population statistics that you present in your evidence, do they take into account the itinerant sort of workers that this district probably relies heavily on over the the picking season and whatnot?
No, they don't. They are permanent, estimated permanent households.
So those itinerant workers, do they place an additional? Well, they must place some additional demand on water resource. Is it a significant demand?
That hasn't actually been calculated. So the registered employer scheme, RSE as we call them, are a significant component of peak population, and to the around 5,000 odd people over the season. So it is very significant. They are accommodated in a variety of different ways. Some of them are in individual households, putting pressure on housing supply, although that's not huge, but certainly into rural cottages that have been converted, and the District Council has recently completed a plan change to provide specifically for RSE workers an industrial zone and camps, if you like, specific design accommodation on rural properties, notwithstanding that that consumes some of the versatile resource. It also requires some water, which are being supplied by the rural people. So,
and the other query I had, and it may have been the evidence, I might have missed it, but the District Council, have they done any investigation into storage as an additional source of water?
So Mr Chapman can perhaps give you more details on that, but we are on a flat plain. We don't have too many hills on our back doorstep, such as Dunedin might, for example. It's got 6 or 7 dams to supply that water. Yep. So the storage in the context of the heavy towing is likely to be storage off-river, upriver, and delivered downriver.
Well, yeah, and that's what I was getting at. Is the council looking at options in that?
So as I understand it, the regional council is undertaking a regional water needs assessment of the nature envisaged with the original land and water management strategy. The first phase of that is to actually better able to predict the demand and the current supplies and where they're going, how they're being used in a lot more detail. And the second phase is then to look at filling the gap, which would be in terms of the storage. Now, the Hastings District Council has indicated it does want to be closely involved in those discussions. And I guess this goes back to my point about there needs to be flexibility to address the issue that we have before us in multiple ways, and that the District Council and the Napier City Council and the Regional Council collectively need to be working together on that.
Thank you.
I just had just following up questions just on the census, just so I just understand it. So this is the census predictions that were done pre-COVID.
Okay, so the forward predictions, the 20, sorry, I'll just find the page in the evidence.
Yeah, just looking at those ones here from 94 onwards.
Oh, we got it right. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So the bottom line.
So I'm just
so
wondering.
the 2020 projections.
Yes.
So those ones which variously have 31,000 and 52,000. So those are the latest Stats New Zealand subnational population projections which were released earlier this year.
Okay.
So they are post-COVID.
Post-COVID, yeah.
Yep.
And
so those subnational population projections, as I understand them, for across the country, assume in the medium term a net inwards migration to New Zealand of about 25,000 people per annum.
so predicated on international immigration.
Yes. Yeah. And so just to put that into context, over the previous 5 years before COVID, the net immigration rate was up around the 50 to 70,000 people, which is why so many of the projections from only a few years before that were so underestimating what actually happened. So we had a massive period of immigration in New Zealand that wasn't really anticipated.
So that sounds like that's a key driver. And I just wonder if there are any others that we should be aware of. Most trends in New Zealand cities is continuation of urban shift from people from living in rural areas or provinces to the regional capital. I know we don't have regional capitals in New Zealand, but internationally that's the trends, and you're seeing that in New Zealand, people migrating to the large cities in their districts or regions.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it is a complicated area. The housing issue in Auckland appears to have motivated some exodus, if you like, to the regions. Some data that we have had has said that 6% of buyers in Hawke's Bay were from Auckland, and over the 2017 period that went up to about 15%. but it's slipped back again now that that market's stabilised at best. But you may have heard of the term the halo effect, and so now you've seen Manawa 2 and Dunedin and Invercargill following similar trends.
And I've made an assumption, I'd like you to correct it or not, that growth areas will be around the nodes of growth that you have currently existing.
So the current urban development strategy is to round off and square off the urban boundaries on it's all versatile soils encircling us, to round off those bits and pieces that so that we can still connect to the existing services, but they often have been subdivided down such that the productive potential is more limited than perhaps a little bit further out. But there is a great deal of tension even around that, and so the next iteration is going to be probably less greenfields, whereas the NPS, I think, UD, urban development, anticipates more. So we have quite a conundrum.
Up and out.
Yeah, up and out.
Yes.
Yes. So certainly intensification is going to be an important component.
Thank you.
One of the questions that I still haven't really got a full satisfactory answer to is how you give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai. I keep going back to it. And whilst what I understand you to be saying here, that the hierarchy set up under Te Mana o Te Wai is not in question, but how you give effect to that. And I'm looking in particular at para 7 in your summary, where you say, as well as addressing the specific issue, councils are concerned about how quickly the community can sustain the changes required. And that's the bit that the question I want to ask. What do you mean by that? The changes, what changes? What are the changes that need to be implemented to give effect to the Te Mana o Te Wai? Because I'm not sure that those changes are that clear to everybody.
No, I agree with you. This is a matter of scale and degree and the rate of progress. Because clearly we wouldn't be here if those obligations were being met now. So something needs to change, and that change needs to happen from within the community. And this plan change is about achieving those changes, or some of those changes, or making progress on those changes. But it could be a journey.
Okay.
Yeah, it could be a long journey, because there's a lot at stake, and that's what my evidence has tried to show. In making changes, there's a lot of consequences that flow from that, and there's a lot at stake. So our position as councils that look after communities, but also respect environments, is that we need to tread cautiously and take the community with us.
But are you able to actually identify some of those actual changes? Some things like, I'm not even sure what that's, but I'm trying to get a sense of what communities need to do to enable Te Mana o Te Wai to be seen, to be given effect to. And I'm struggling at the moment.
Okay, so the plan change is going to be the primary vehicle for achieving those changes. And again, that's why we think that we should bank all the effort now in terms of getting some improvements now. So that's reducing or removing the unused allocation, which is double the used allocation.
Okay. Well,
yep, that's the first thing. Very important.
That's one, yeah.
Because that's a major risk to achieving Te Mana o Te Wai.
Yeah.
The second one is to put everybody on notice and through the consenting process to achieve at least actual and reasonable, if not better than that. Mm-hmm. So wastage and unnecessary use is removed. Yep. So that will result in improvement. I think the argument or the difficulty is how much can we achieve with those sorts of measures, how much, how fast, and that is your job.
Yeah,
where we can be as helpful as we can, but we are signalling a need to be a little bit cautious because there's so much at stake for people and communities.
Yeah, I guess everybody is saying you need to take a precautionary approach to this whole thing. But I indicated the other day that I don't know, it's hard not to get a sense of some prevarication, right? Partly because people are unclear what they need to do, but it's almost like they don't want to do it.
Yeah, I would suggest for the council's perspective, that's not the case.
Okay, all right, that's what I want.
That's not the case, and what I've tried to show in my evidence with the council's adopting some principles around how it wants to react in the water space in the future, with those principles that I outlined. Those are, the councils were keen and willing to take that approach, and it signals a significant change in attitude, and I think that's been arrived at because now there is, with the work the regional councils have done through the tank plan change on the model, has actually fundamentally changed our understanding. Okay. And I think that's really important. The challenge that the councils are going to have, and my friends behind me is going to come next, and Mr. Bond down there, is how to take our communities with us so that, because the bigger savings are actually at the household.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge I'm highlighting. It's just how do you take the people along?
The people need.
What is it you say to them? Well, look, in order to do this, we all need to be doing something together, and you've already identified that. I mean, all three councils. I don't, I'm not for 1 minute arguing that the councils are not in favour of it or don't support it.
Yeah.
But I think we're still struggling to find out what is actually, what the real journey is, I guess.
And I think that the heartening thing is that through all of these changes that have come through the various MPSs, the community out there have been on board with the need to do something. So we know that their heart's in the right place, we think, or most of them. We only just need to get them to be able to put that into action.
Good. Thanks. I won't belabor it any further. Thanks very much, Mr. Clues.
Welcome.
I think Dr. Kerr's got some more questions, just for specific ones.
Just a couple of questions, Mr. Close. If I can take you to paragraph 27 in your evidence, 25 in your evidence and check. So you talk about wet industry there, and I understand that the wet industries are almost all supplied from their own bores. Is that true?
I don't know. I haven't done that analysis, but I would suspect so. Most of the employment and the GDP come from, as you'd expect, food processing, either meatworks or fruit and veg processing. They're the big chunk, probably over half of those numbers. And we do know that they have their own bores, because simply they require more water than we can supply through a municipal system. And Mr. Chapman will talk about that in terms of what we do supply to industry. It's not processed water.
Okay, thank you. I'd be interested in knowing the extent to which wet industry is supplied from municipal supply from somebody, just as a general question.
Yeah, we can certainly try. I'm just not sure how easy that is going to be to do.
Even just an indication.
Sure.
Is it 5% of the municipal supply? Is it 2%? Is it 10%? I'm not looking for the last.
If Mr. Chapman knows off the top of his head, I'm sure we'll cover it when it gets to him.
Thank you. And my other comment, your paragraph 37, and the HDC is not attempting to avoid a conservation and demand approach to urban water, nor is it attempting to create scope for increased overall abstraction for urban growth or increased economic, rural or industrial activity. That's not the way I read Mr. Drury's evidence. It seems to me that that is exactly what the council is endeavouring to do. So does that paragraph relate to the 90 million cubic metres? Does that Can you explain it to
So,
me?
yes, that's right. That is saying we're not attempting to create scope to increase extraction beyond 90 million cubic metres.
Thank you.
Mr. Drury will clarify that perhaps in a little bit more detail when he gets to the specific changes being sought.
Thank you. So you're not questioning the 90 million cubic metres?
No.
Thank you.
Other than Mr. Drury will talk about whether that should be a target or a limit.
Yeah, I know.
Sarah, is it helpful if Mr. Drury should address that now? So we're dealing with it now, or are you happy for us to come back to it?
Let's deal with that now. Yeah.
So I think my evidence relates to the potential increase in scope for municipal uses when water becomes available for reallocation. That's probably the key message there. There will be, the plan change obviously throws out a lot of tools to pull back allocation, so presumably that will be achieved, and there will be some allocation available to be reallocated in the future. I'm suggesting that the increased scope for that should be for municipal suppliers to take that up.
It's not the, I guess, Mr. Drury, it's not really the impression we've had from other user groups. I think they all think that they would want their full share, or a proportion of their full share in terms of the actual and reasonable use definition in the addendum report. And as I would read it, your non-complying activity, or proposed non-complying activity, would allow discretion above that 90 million cubic metre, that 90 million cubes. So it's a matter we can discuss later, but certainly that's the way I would read it in terms of your interpretation of rules 11 and 12.
Yes, yeah, that would be correct, and that relates to the fact that limits should be seen as more of a target for this period until the review of policy 42.
I know that's what you say.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. That was all our questions.
Thank you. Next is Ms. Welcome.
Yes.
I would like to reiterate that the Napier City Council have been working closely with the Hastings Council in the preparation of our submission and our evidence. I have largely support Mr. Clue's evidence provided on the summary of evidence, and he has answered to some of your questions, which obviously apply to Napier City Council as well. Overall, Napier City Council is very supportive of the objectives and direction of Plan Change 9, and I would like to acknowledge the work of all the parties involved in the time process, and especially the officers that have developed the Plan Change 9 as well. Napier City Council is conscious that it's required to provide by law safe and adequate water supply to residents and enable growth, and that point has been clearly stated back in Mr. Clue's evidence and also detailed in my evidence. We are actively working on making efficiencies in our use of municipal water, and Mr. Bond would touch base on that aspect as well for Napier City Council. As an update to my evidence, we have just finalized the hearing for the long-term plan, and the water is #1 priority for our community and for the council. And all the projects and investment earmarked for the long-term plan it's going to stay in the long-term plan after that hearing process as well. So decisions are due on the 30th of June, but as I said, they have been mainly in support of that water as a priority, and we foresee that that's going to stay the same. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
I just heard one question. It might be a question for Mr. Bond. It was just wanting to understand a little bit better that the investment, this is at your paragraph 11 in your evidence, the investment in water supply over the next 10 years of 75 million. I'm just wondering if you're the right person or Mr. Bond's the right person. I just want to just understand that a bit better in terms of what that investment is looking like in terms of water supply.
Yeah, I think that Mr. Bond will be more appropriate to respond to that.
Do you wish?
Yeah, happy for you to answer the question.
Excuse me. So just the water supply specifically?
Yes.
Okay. We had a water master plan developed the last 2 years. With that is looking at a lot of that as a result of the changes nationally as a result of Havelock in terms of public health management. So we're looking predominantly to develop 2 bore fields with then 2 treatment plants on that process stream. We're looking at having dedicated rising mains from those sources through to the 2 main zones, one being Taradale and the other being Mataruaho, Napier Hill, and then having the so that allows the water to go directly to the reservoirs and then being gravity fed from those reservoirs back into the network. So with that, we've got a resulting to upsize water pipes for fire flows. The current system has the bores pumping directly into our network, so it pressurises the network from those areas. So with changing it to a gravity fed supply, you've got to allow more capacity to come flowing back rather than being pumped. And that's having the 2 separate systems with the dedicated rising mains allows us to economically treat that water rather than having treatment plants on individual bores. We have a range of them around the city at the moment, so we're looking to consolidate that. That's the general, just providing resilience. Yeah, the goal is clean.
I'm just trying to get a sense of what some of the key drivers are: resilience,
safe
and capacity, safety,
compliant. Yeah, clean, safe water, and also to improve pressure and flow.
Okay, thank you. We didn't have any other questions for you as well. I'm very sorry about that.
Thank you.
And we're just going to do a little bit of a reshuffle to bring Mr.
Sure.
Chapman on. Oh, okay.
Good morning. I'm at the doing end, and a lot of the questions I've heard this morning are about what we're doing in our 3 water space. So I just want to start off by saying that, when we turn the tap on, our expectation is that clean, safe water will come out of the tap. When we flush the loo, it goes away. And nobody ever gives a thought to what's happening in behind the scenes to make that happen. I'll address the, and that's just the reality, that's the reality of where we are. In terms of my qualifications, I have an NZC in civil engineering. I've undertaken the training, the NZQA training for drinking water assessors, which covers treatment, distribution and public health implications. I spent 6 years on the board of IPWEA, the Institute of Public Works Engineers Australasia. In my 30 years of working in the industry, I've been active in the industry, attending training, workshops and presenting at conferences. And more latterly, I've been a key advisor to the Ministry of Health and the DIA in respect of the Drinking Water Standards Review and the 3 Waters Reform, and that's primarily from our experience with the Havelock North contamination event. If you would like, I will continue to perhaps respond to the questions, or would you like me to work through my summary of evidence? What would you prefer?
Perhaps if we keep that momentum going, if you can respond to some of those questions, and then we'll see
Sure.
where we need to go through.
Okay, in terms of current leakage assessment, the leakage that we undertake, with the assessment we undertake each year, we're around about 20% of leakage. We tend to use the terminology non-revenue water rather than leakage, because there is operational water that's not always measured either. But what I do want to point out, there's no national standard for leakage assessment. There's no standard methodology. So when you hear one water supplier talking about 20%, one talking about 15%, and water suppliers talking about litres per person per day, then you're not comparing apples with apples. So there is no standard at the moment.
No standard, that sounds like a consultant's dream.
Indeed.
So just to be clear, if you're pumping 1,000, if you're taking 1,000 cubic metres out of a bore,
Yes.
then on average 80% of that is reaching end users. Is that?
No. The 20% includes leakage on properties.
So,
Our pipes leak, properties,
So
pipes leak too.
next question, do you know how much of that is on individual properties versus within your network?
No, we don't. We don't undertake individual metering of properties or universal metering. So we have 500 metres deployed across our domestic users, covering various different types of properties, to provide some indication of what the total usage from a domestic point of view is. We meter all of our industrial, commercial and extraordinary users. So all of the larger users are covered, but we don't have universal metering. We use surrogate measurements for that.
Is there any particular reason for not introducing metering?
Council's never had a reason to put universal metering in. And this is part of the situation we find ourselves in now, where, because there haven't been restrictions on water use, perception has been we've had unlimited quantities underneath our feet, so it's easy to get, it's cheap, so why would you meter for it unless you wanted to use it as a revenue collection?
So when you say larger users are metered, is that generally commercial? Is there a threshold at which metering starts?
In our bylaws we define extraordinary and ordinary users. So ordinary users are single household domestic, or the purpose or the use is for domestic only. We separate out rural residential larger lot properties because they tend to have higher irrigation use, and all of our commercial, whether it be a small business, one person business, right up to our large industrial users, where they're measured for their the potable supplies that we provide for the people that work there.
So if I owned a childcare centre, that would be metered?
Yes.
So what you're saying essentially is it's only individual properties that aren't rural residential that aren't metered, and all those, so that there's anything over and above that is metered.
Correct. Yeah.
So how many people are, or how many individual properties are metered? Is that in the several thousands?
We have in total over 23,000 connections.
Yep.
Of that, we have a sample selection of 500 urban domestic properties that we use for surrogate measurement of the balance of the community. One other comment that I did write down when I was making some notes is that water meters invoke a right as long as somebody's prepared to pay. And I think this comes back to the question around values, how we might apply Te Mana Oti Wai in this environment. And I think that we have to connect with the people at the end of the tap. We can't stop delivering water to them. It's about how they use that water within their properties, and the connection needs to be back to the environment and to public health. Havelock North has provided a very strong message around public health, but I don't think that there's a connection with the environment in terms of turning on the tap or flushing the loo. And I think it's a huge opportunity for tangata whenua with mana whenua to actually lead that challenge. And that's how I think that we will be able to provide the connection. It's a connection with the people, not about what we might do or not do. We can't simply turn off the tap at a network level and say, oh, well, you've had your quota now, you can't have any more. And just for context, I've mentioned the 23,000 connections and 450 kilometres of pipes. Our pipes are sized for firefighting, so we have to have large network pipes, and naturally they have the potential to leak more than an individual property or a small pipe. I would like to draw your attention to paragraph 35 of my evidence and figure 5, because I think they go to the demonstrating in some way what Hastings District Council has been doing for quite some time in terms of water conservation and demand management, of which we've had an approved strategy since 2013. But particularly in paragraph 35, I mentioned there the work that we do on an ongoing basis in terms of applying annual water restrictions and an education program across our summer months, the metering of all non-domestic water users. We've implemented 5 demand management or pressure reduction zones, and we've increased our renewals program over a period of time to proactively replace assets prior to failure. And you'll have to understand that despite your best efforts, things will fail in the middle of the night that you didn't anticipate. What has been apparent in the last 3 years is that a lot of our leakages come about from failed water laterals. So the copper pipes, which are prevalent across Hastings, are now at the end of their lives and pinholed, and we now have a full replacement program rather than repair and wait for the next leak. So we've committed to an investment in putting new assets in rather than trying to keep old assets going. We've undertaken investigations in terms of smart metering. So when we talk about metering, our desire is to connect our communities with the water that they're using in real time, so that they are not surprised by a water bill 3 months later for a leak or increased irrigation or water usage that they were unaware in terms of the volume they were using. So smart metering provides an opportunity for both the network supplier and the user to be connected to what they're doing in real time. The cost of smart metering for our entire network will be in excess of $15 million. And it's probably likely, my perception is that as we move to new entities outside of councils, then metering, universal metering will probably be the way that they will both measure and monitor and use that for revenue collection. In addition to the things I've mentioned, an $89 million investment in water treatment and storage within the Hastings urban area will also provide us with the opportunity to undertake network-wide pressure reduction We operate at very high pressures because we pump directly from the bores to our reservoirs at high altitude, and we are looking to separate off the high areas from the flat land through network management, and that will allow us to reduce pressures from in excess of 1,000 kPa to nearer to 500 or 600. That will take a period of time to implement. The construction's planned to be completed by the end of 2022, and you could probably imagine that if we went from an operating environment of 1,000 kPa to 600 overnight, there would be quite a reaction within the community. So we want to do this gently and gradually so that we can understand where the effects are and then what we have to do to ensure that we can continue to deliver a level of service.
Yeah, I don't think the customers will be nostalgic.
No. Particularly on the basis that they're paying a significant amount of money to implement all of this as well.
What was that number of investment? I just can't...
89
89.
million for new treatment plants, new bores and reservoir storage.
Okay.
And I note that there was a question around storage. I know it was in the context of much wider storage to offset our increased use of the groundwater. It's a challenge for us, and while we would support that, our preference would be for municipal supplies or drinking water supplies to be drawing water from the groundwater system, which is relatively clean and is safer than having to install significant amounts of treatment to treat water stored from a dam to then deliver into the municipal system. So certainly a great way to offset usage, but we would want to continue to draw from groundwater, and that stored water is used for other purposes. If I can move to, I guess the one other item I would want to mention is that we are looking to reduce our leakage to 15% in the next 10 years. So the strategies that I've already talked about, we are expecting or anticipating that will lead us closer to a 15% leakage figure. And in my submission I've talked about the network-wide pressure reductions and what we expect to achieve over time, which is 3.5 million litres less usage or less leakage per day.
Can I just follow up a question with that, Mr. Chairman? You said 15% reduction down to 15% by in how many years' time?
10 years' time.
So I think in your evidence you've got next, paragraph 35I, you've got reduced leakage to 15% over the next 20 years.
10 to 20 years, yep.
10 to 20 now.
Again, I can't, in terms of the investment, while I can put plans in place to increase the investment to meet these targets, they are still subject to council approval. What we are trying to do is set a regime for the new entities to continue to work on this this program.
Mr. Bond's evidence, paragraph 39, said it was leakage was originally estimated at 22%
for Napier.
Oh, okay. That's just specific to Napier. Okay. So is there a gold standard for leakage?
There's the ILI, the Infrastructure Leakage Index, which is an international framework for understanding leakage. What I do know is that in some parts of Europe, where they have leakage down to as low as 3%, and they've only been able to achieve that over like a 30-year time frame, and a huge amount of investment has gone into making that happen. their original desire was to ensure that they had a chlorine-free, or a system that was as safe as a system that has chlorine, so they were able to demonstrate that safety was not compromised. And the benefit of that level of investment in terms of managing infrastructure was that they were able to drive their leakage down to significantly lower levels. But I would have to say that on the evidence of experts that I've heard in this field, for New Zealand to drive down to those levels is far beyond the capability of any water supplier in New Zealand at the moment.
So that's the figure one in Ms Sweeney's evidence that she's got the infrastructure leakage and
That's the
one.
I have that as 36 of my evidence. It's American Water Works Association. Right, that's from the National Performance Review.
And I think she has some comparative data.
Yeah.
Her figure, just preceding paragraph 39,
Yes.
paragraph 40. Is that correct? That's the
That
same.
information is taken from the National Performance Review, so I would expect.
So it's what I'm saying is it's the same thing you're referring to,
Yes.
what she's shown.
If you were hypothetically able to get down to say 5% leakage, that saving, if you like, in water, or what you've managed to recoup back,
Yeah.
how far would that go to satisfying or providing for the expected growth in population?
So 10%, our base usage is about 35,000 cubes a day. So 10% of that, 3,500 cubes. If you were to work on simplifying it, 1,000 litres per household per day, 3,500 households.
Okay, thank you.
So if you want to, the only way of reducing leakage is essentially replacing subsurface infrastructure, is that?
Well, I think we recognise that putting water meters in place has an impact on usage within the home because people are now more conscious of what they're paying. The opportunity to, as I've talked about, introducing smart metering, which gets people connected on a daily basis, will drive further benefits, and it will also help to identify leakage within the home. So as I've already said, leakage doesn't just happen in the public space, it happens in the private space as well. So more intensive monitoring in terms of metering will help to identify that.
But the primary focus of actually that long-term objective to reduce leakage from the system is replacement of old copper pipes with modern PVC or flexible joints, etc., etc.
Yes, polyethylene is the plastic of the day. The weakness with most systems is not the pipe material itself, it's the joints. The jointing systems fail, and yet you have a perfectly good asset. The connecting bits are the bits that fail. And if I use an example, asbestos cement as a material product that was heavily used in the 50s, 60s and 70s. That's all now coming to the end of its useful life, and it makes up about 29% of our network. So 30% of 450 kilometres of pipe is around 120 kilometres. You're not going to do that in a year.
If you come from Christchurch, you've seen an awful lot of that thing happening.
Yes.
I'm not suggesting you need a good earthquake to accelerate your infrastructure replacement, but it's certainly
perhaps
helped
one
there.
benefit of Christchurch. Yes.
We've already had one.
I think a large portion of the old clay pipes have certainly been replaced.
But I think that does reflect that the approach in terms of renewing assets also has a resilience component within this as well. So where we have fragile assets, and we use AC in that space, then we're proactively replacing that as the investment and the community can afford that, to get rid of assets that won't serve us well if we ever have a major earthquake.
Yes, true. Yesterday we had Dr. Jones from the DHB gave evidence or spoke to his submission more accurately, and one of the matters he raised was the NES supply to communities over 2008 NES for drinking water supply to communities of under 500, and one of those he mentioned was Omaha. What would be involved in bringing a community like Omaha, which I gather probably gets its water from a surface water source, the stream, here we are, I think it is. What would be involved in upgrading a water supply like that?
Well, Omahu itself has it's a community that's partly serviced by a community supply that we manage. Water is taken from bores that are close to the Narora River, so it's considered a surface take.
Yeah.
And there's a reluctance from the unserviced community to move to a community supply, and the reasons are, firstly, why should we have to? So when we have the issue around safe water, they have on-site septic tanks, and they also have the ability to impact adversely on their own drinking water supplies. And we had that very situation in the Pakipaki community, which we have now extended the Hastings supply to, because of the public health risks of on-site wastewater and private water supplies being essentially interconnected. In terms of a very poignant example of servicing a community that wasn't serviced, Bridge Park is where the Hastings District Council stepped in about 2009, when we had a community where the private bores were running out of water because of the groundwater depletion. And we built essentially a network out to that entire community. Some of that was funded through the central government capital assistance program, and the balance was funded from the Hastings community itself. So it is possible. There's always an engineering solution, but it does come down to cost and need. Yeah.
So is Bridge Park more than 500 people?
It's the wider community of which we serviced. It's a fairly so it covers a broad area. It's not intense in its location, but it was around 500 properties, so more than 500 people.
Another topic I want to ask a question about. This, I don't think I've read anything in the evidence from the District Council about stormwater, and there's quite a lot from Hastings District, Napier City, because I know their stormwater goes to Ahura Estuary, and that's a particularly sensitive environment. Where does I presume that most of the stormwater from Havelock North goes to the Karamu,
Correct.
And from Hastings itself?
Hastings, everything in Hastings drains to the Karamu catchment as well, ultimately to that.
And those consents, are they coming up for replacement sometime in the reasonably near future?
Yes, next year, 2022.
So, and the council, I don't think, has taken a very strong stance against the provisions in Plan Change 9 relating to stormwater. Can I take it from that the council's reasonably comfortable with meeting those provisions as they exist in Plan Change 9?
We've effectively been operating under those requirements since 2010. The consent, as it was at that time, included significant number of conditions which we're expecting to be rolled through in a plan change around 2013, and have set there. So we've been operating in an environment that has been more substantive and extensive than the rules and provisions provided for. So effectively for us, we'll continue to move on that journey. So we're not in a situation where we're catching up. The rules and the provisions and the plan change are actually catching up to where we are.
Okay, thank you.
I just noticed we haven't covered off from your summary and your evidence any other points regarding source protection zones.
Yes.
Was there any particular points you wanted to make to us?
Yes, I would, and I think it's important that the backdrop to source protection is around this paradigm that we lived in where groundwater was considered immune from contamination, and that was well and truly debunked with the Havelock North contamination event. I think the relevance of that is that there was a significant amount of sickness with over 5,000 people becoming ill, 50 hospitalisations, and it contributed to 4 deaths. The situation at the time was that the Brookvale water supply, the science and the evidence that we had around that demonstrated that we met the requirements for bore security as such, which I know will not be provided for in the new drinking water standards. So the very information that we had around the business as usual, as we like to call it, gave us a false sense of security that everything was fine. And I think that's important in terms of the discussion around the science being used to determine whether a line sits here or whether it sits there. As I've submitted in my summary evidence, that the extent and the nature of the source protection zone is at best fuzzy. The science will never be able to accurately determine whether it sits here or there. And that's why I'm strongly proposing a very precautionary approach and being conservative in this space. If I can use an example, yesterday I was notified that a large chemical storage company is coming to town, and they're going to be setting up in an area which just happens to be right on the fringe of the source protection zone. Now, the regional council, or the numerical model, doesn't quite pick up that area. The analytical model just does. But I think it shows a point where we might be satisfied that a business that's going to have significant agrochemicals stored on site will be right on the fringe of a source protection zone. And it's not so much about what happens day to day. When there's an accident or there's a flood, those contaminants have the potential to get out into the environment. And we don't want that to happen where our drinking water sources come from. So for me, it kind of demonstrates that we should always be cautious, and as a water supplier, we need to have the ability to be advised of when these risks might occur, and before businesses set up and those contaminants appear in our source protection zones, that we have some ability to be able to engage with those applicants and understand what they're doing, and being able to put our thoughts and ideas forward around what they might need to do to mitigate those risks.
In terms of triggering the process.
Yeah, it's about triggering the process and ensuring that we can be satisfied that the mitigation measures, because as we know, accidents happen, and we don't want those accidents to impact on our drinking water sources. As Ms Davidson referred to was the Omahu industrial area. That concerns me, where we have an industrial area that's been there for quite some time, continues to expand, and we continue to grant discharges of wastewater and stormwater to land when they're in close proximity to a reticulated network. And we need to change the landscape here. We need to ensure that the risks are made apparent to us, and if it means that we have to extend our networks for wastewater to provide a mechanism to take those contaminants away, rather than put them on the land and wait for a flood or something to transport them somewhere else. I think that's a better way.
If that area floods Napier, Hastings might have some serious problems as well, I suspect. Just looking at your map.
Yeah.
Just see if we've got any further questions for you, Mr. Chairman. And if we don't, we're going to take a bit of a break. Doesn't seem like there's any more questions. We'll, June, we'll come back at 11:20. And we've got last two.
We've got Mr. Bond and then the two planning witnesses.
Yes, that's right. Thank you.